All right, the Eden Monaro by-election is ramping up as the Nationals put forward a candidate following weeks of bickering within the party. And Australia's relationship with China remains in the spotlight as Victoria's controversial Belt and Road deal raises new concerns around foreign affairs and international trade. Joining me now, Liberal Senator and retired Major General Jim Molan. Senator Molan, great to have you on the show tonight. Look, Andrews is out on a bit of a limb here with this Belt and Road deal with China. He's copped plenty of criticism, and I thought the best piece I've seen thus far was by Greg Sheridan today in The Australian, where basically he called him out and said that Andrews was putting the Australian national interest second to the interests of Victoria, and he felt that was treacherous. What are your thoughts?
So I think that's exactly right. Greg Sheridan is a very perceptive writer. He's a Victorian, lives down there and lives in the middle of that state. I don't think that writing and saying that, though, is going to have much impact on the socialist Daniel Andrews or on the way that he runs his state. And it is quite true that he has overstepped the mark, and he's overstepped the mark quite dramatically. As Greg says, if Daniel Andrews is now going to take as his right to set Victorian foreign policy, then he has a moral obligation to take foreign policy all the way through. That is, to take it down to the human rights that China exercises, the way they treat the Uyghurs, yes, the way they treat other nations in the South China Sea. At the moment, China is in conflict with so many nations. It's like a United Nations. It goes Australia, Hong Kong, UK, US, Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, Canada, India, Norway and Taiwan. And that's just this week, Glee. So
they don't mind a stink, Jim.
That's right. You wouldn't want to miss out, would you?
No. There's plenty of countries there that they've decided to pick on. I mean, I just think it's the way in which they've been carrying on, particularly, you know, I mean, we've basically just tried to get to the bottom of what happened with this virus so that humanity can continue going forward without the threat of it being even more punitive and even more deadly. I just find their behaviour to be just out of sorts with what the world sees as a responsible country.
Well, I think it does allow a Labor state just to spend and spend and spend and borrow. And I'm not too sure of the exact procedures, but I would assume that when it comes down to the money actually moving across the borders, should they go ahead with this non-transparent activity they're involved in, when it does come down to part of the $24 billion coming into the state of Victoria, that the Foreign Investment Review Board will have something to say about that. And at the moment, what they've signed might be treaty-like, but it's not a treaty. It's just a bunch of kind of Chinese Communist Party generalised wording. So at the moment, I'm not overly worried about it, but it just goes to exactly what the character of Daniel Andrews and the character of the state of Victoria is like. As my good people down in Victoria, they keep voting him back in.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. All right, now Albo, $2,500 a plate for a virtual dinner. Eden Monaro by-election, gee, you know, $2,500 and you don't even get to shake his hand. I think that's a bit hot. But what are your thoughts on Eden Monaro, Jim? I mean, this is going to be a really tight battle. It always is. Dare I say it? It's always been a bellwether seat. But three very good candidates actually now.
Well, I think we have the best candidate, but it is going to be very, very hard. We haven't won, you know, a government hasn't won a by-election off an opposition for 100 years, as we all know that. We all know that statement. But I think as people get to know Fiona Cotvoice, they will begin to understand what an extraordinary candidate she is. I know her very, very well. We went through the last election together. She took us took us to a 2% swing back to where the Liberal Party should be, and that's well and truly within striking distance of this. And all we have to do now, all she has to do, is turn over 800 votes, and we've got the seat. And if you look at the quality and the background of the two candidates, I think this is absolutely key. And if you look at Fiona, she's a small businesswoman, she's a farmer, she's a member of the RFS, she's a member of the Reserve, she's a teacher, she's worked in international aid overseas for many, many years. She has an extraordinary CV, and I think it is worth every voter in Eden Monaro having a look at that and reading about it. And as the time goes on, we've only got 4 and a bit weeks now until the election. This is a fast election. It'll be a different election. It'll be a webinar election. It'll be a Skype or Zoom election. And people can get to know her very, very well, despite the fact that there will be limitations on us getting out into the street and talking.
Jim, I know you keep a close eye on America, and I know Trump's under a lot of pressure. His response to COVID has been criticised quite heavily. Biden's ahead in the polls. Where's America sitting with all this sort of hairy-chested way in which China's carrying on, and their economy's obviously been really affected by the pandemic implications? In the superpower stakes that America has always been at the top, where do they currently sit?
I think this is the most interesting part of our strategic environment at the moment. We in countries like Australia and in the Western liberal democracy spend all our time looking at Russia and China and Iran and Hong Kong as the 4 nations which are developing military power and influence to an extraordinary level. And because the US is an ally, we rarely look at it. We look at our nations that we may bump up against in a conflict sense or who are competitive ours, as to whether they have the intent to commit military action and whether they have the capability. If they don't have the intent but they have the capability, you can change the intent overnight. If you have the intent but no capability, who cares? If we applied that same thing to the United States of America, and we must do it because we have this underlying strategy in Australia, or belief, I should say, in Australia, that the United States will always come to our aid. Why should we try hard to do X, Y, and Z in the defence or security thing? The goddams are always there, and they'll always come to our aid. Well, the big problem we face is that since the end of the Cold War, 89 to 91 roughly, since the end of the Cold War, American military power and influence, by my reckoning, but also by the reckoning of US organisations and by the reckoning of the national security strategy, the official White House national security strategy of the US, American power and influence has lessened by, I reckon, at least a half and probably a bit over a half. They're only half as good as they used to be, and yet they're facing 4 nations that they didn't face before. And the relevance to us, this is not an esoteric activity, the relevance to us is that we keep saying to ourselves, well, we're doing very well in relation to national sovereignty, to national self-reliance, to resilience. And it doesn't really matter anyhow because the Americans will always come to our aid. Well, I've got news. Since President Trump, who knows what his intent is towards the Allies. And since the combat in the Middle East and President Obama, American military capability has dropped dramatically. That's the message, Peter, that I reckon we ought to be very, very concerned about. And the only way we can look at it is through us doing a national security strategy from tours.
Well, there he is, Jim Molan, Senator Jim Molan. Look, they're prescient words, there's no doubt about that. That's a real warning from a bloke who does know. Jim Molan, thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gleeso. Thank you.